Welcome to the Web Design Business Podcast with your host, Josh Hall, helping you build a web design business that gives you freedom and a lifestyle you love.
Hello, friends. Welcome into the podcast. This is episode 216, where we are going to take a deep dive into what I can only assume is your favorite aspect of web design. And of course, I'm talking about website security. Now, in all seriousness, when I became a web designer, the last thing on my mind, unfortunately, was security. Perhaps because I came from a design background and just kind of worked my way into web design. I was not developer first, so I didn't really have a mind for what's behind websites. Often, like clients often do, they need help understanding that a website is not just a pretty design that's flat on the internet. There's a lot behind it, and security, as we'll hear in this episode, is a lot like an onion. There's kind of multiple layers to it. And what I wanted to do specifically in this episode is scratch off the first couple layers of website security. So we're going to talk about the basics of website security. We're going to talk about the most known and most important vulnerabilities that you should be aware of as a web designer for your site, your clients, and your business, so you reduce this scary L word called liabilities for your business. So for this episode, I'm so excited to bring on one of my web design students. This is Dan Cook, who I've got to know over quite a few months as a member in my web design club. And I got to know Dan as a solid entrepreneur, a great web designer, but I also found out that he knows a lot about website security. So I encouraged him to really take the lead in offering some more resources to kind of share what he knows about website security. And I'm excited because Dan has a brand new brand called riskbuddy.com. And Buddy is with an I, so I'd highly recommend you check that out after this episode. And we'll have that linked in the show notes at joshhall.co/216. But Dan's got a lot of great resources right now and ahead for you in regards to website security. And in this episode, we're going to cover the basics. We also, heads up, do get into some of the more intermediate and a couple advanced things when it comes to security. Some of you will love that. Some of you might, like myself, you might be a little confused or daunted. We do cover a lot of links, so all those links and resources are going to be at the show notes at joshhall.co/216. They'll be available for you. But I think my goal, and I think the goal of this episode, is to empower you with at least the basics and the most important things in regards to website security. So I'm really excited to hear how this helps you. And last thing I wanted to know, Dan is actually, if you're listening to this when it comes out, going to be doing a live training in my web design club that's more visual and more in-depth on security. And even if you don't catch this before he does the training, you can watch the replay when you join my web design club. You can go to joshhall.co/coaching for more information on that to get access to the club, and you can watch this training live if you're hearing this episode right now, or you can catch the replay if you're hearing this later on. But for right now, here's Dan. Let's talk the basics of website security. Dan, welcome onto the podcast, man. Thanks for taking some time to chat today.
Hey, Josh. Great to finally be on here.
It's great to have you on, man. You've been in the web design club for a little while, and it's been really cool to get to know you and to see what you've done in your business. And I feel like the past handful of months, you made it aware to me that you actually have kind of this hidden gem of knowledge about website security. And it's something that you have a lot of interest in. And I was like, dude, we need to explore that. And I think a lot of web designers are like me today, where website security is one of the last things we tend to think about. There's, in the grand scheme of all of web design, if you're not security minded, it can be like the last thing you think about, which is definitely the category that I fall into. So I'm so excited to pick your brain about this, man. I'm kind of curious, before we dive in, do you want to let everyone know, first off, where you're based out of? And then I'm going to ask you the same question I've been asking a lot of guests recently. When somebody asks you what you do, what do you tell them?
Yeah, so I'm based in Bewdley in the UK, which is this small town near Birmingham. So probably a couple of hours drive from London, because obviously it doesn't take very long to travel around the UK. My answer in a nutshell is I help people design and maintain their websites. But obviously to the club, I also help a bit of security now as well.
Yeah, it is. Like I said, it's an untapped big need, security. I mean, Look, we'll start this podcast out with a, what do I even call it? It shows how non-security minded I am. And this is something when I became a web design person and a web design business owner, I had to get really serious about, but it's not natural to me. And I'll share this story, a little embarrassing, but it's true. Years ago, when I was younger, I was in a phone store, like a Verizon store, and I was waiting, and I logged into, because my old phone was broken or something, I logged into my Facebook to check something on a phone there, and then played around with it. And I completely forgot to log out. So like my Facebook account was just open for whoever. And somebody thankfully was kind enough and decent enough to say, hey, do you know you logged into your Facebook and left it open? And then I changed the password, so on. But I say that to say security, again, is not like the natural thing for me. So what's the most important thing to focus on for people like me who tend to think of security as like the last thing we end up thinking about?
So I think what often gets overlooked is the people side of it. So in that case, the threat, in that case was actually, it was an accidental threat. You just left yourself logged in. It's a bit like going out and leaving your door unlocked. It happens. So everyone always thinks, hackers are going to get in, but actually you can leave threats in place like that.
Oh, that's a good point.
So yeah, I definitely think the people side is something that's well worth considering and thinking about, because it often gets overlooked. It's very easy to think, okay, security, how can I approach that? Well, is there a plugin I could install? Yeah, there certainly is, but a plugin's not going to stop your end users having bad passwords.
That's a good point. I like that analogy of like kind of leaving the door open literally for the threats to come in, which is probably unintentionally what a lot of either web designers are doing, but especially the client side of things if they have access to their website. Let's just dive right into the website side of things, Dan. Like, what have you found what are the unintentional threats like that are common?
Yeah, so good question. I've seen it a few times with domains. So I think we need to go back a step and think, what is security? So we're trying to protect assets from harm. I don't think there's such thing as a truly secure website. There's always going to be little holes, which are called vulnerabilities. But yeah, the main thing that I've seen a few times with some client sites is when they look after their own domains, sometimes they get a few emails saying it's time to renew your domain, but they'll forget to do it. And then the website goes down. Now, security, there's three aspects of it. There's confidentiality, which is, some things we want to keep secret. There's integrity, which is, I've had some orders come through on WooCommerce. I need the addresses to be saved properly. Otherwise, they're not going to receive things. But then there's also availability. So if I've got a website, it needs to actually be live and accessible. And if your client forgets to renew their domain, your website's going to go down. And that's something that you can't control if you don't manage their domain.
Now, would that be what would be the security vulnerabilities for a domain? Because there's the on-site stuff, but then there's actually, like domain registrants and things like that. Are those two things separate? Do you view like domain management and email separate from, well, obviously probably then the actual website and the on-site vulnerabilities?
Yeah, so it depends who manages it. Let's say the client manages it in this case, because I think a lot of people feel like they've got to protect their domains, which is understandable. If us as a web designer manage their domains, we could always hold it back from them. That's how a client sees it. So you need to consider their login to their domain registrar. So let's say they've bought the domain on, say, GoDaddy, 123reg, Amazon Web Services. You've got to consider what password they've got there. If they've used a really bad password and someone gets in, they can just pull down their website and their email.
Yeah, that's a good point. Even from that's like the top level of everything without even drilling into the actual website is like where you are. So is that first lesson where you're hosting the domain name should be a good password and as secure as possible? Yeah.
And two-factor authentication is a great control if you can do that as well. So really encourage your clients to use a good password and two-factor authentication on there.
Yeah, that's good. And I'm sure for web designers, it's even equally or maybe more important if you're managing multiple domain names to have the utmost security you can on that top level. Because look, like email could get hacked separately, a website could get hacked, but if you want to bring a whole presence down, it starts with the domain. So I didn't think about it like that, but that's like the top layer. Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. What about the most common vulnerabilities on the actual website side of things, Dan? This is where we could probably spend 8 hours talking about this, but what have you seen are like the most typical vulnerabilities for just websites, whether they're WordPress or different platforms?
Well, plugins are always the one that people talk about because security is easy to sell because, let's keep our plugins up to date. But here's one for you. Let's say you've installed a plugin from a small company who's decided they no longer want to support the plugin anymore. So after, say, 2 years, they stop working on it, they stop updating it. There's going to be some vulnerabilities that get found at some point with that in the code. So let's say they haven't updated it for 2 years, it's on your website. Someone finds a vulnerability and they can exploit it. Let's say cross-site scripting, which is where you can inject nasty scripts into your website, which is how it gets redirected to dodgy websites and, nasty things pop up, basically. The issue there is there's never going to be an update for that if it's not supported anymore.
Gotcha.
So whilst, yes, updates are important, we should also be looking out for, are there actual vulnerabilities on our site? Are some of these plugins not maintained anymore?
That is a biggie. I'm so glad you brought that up because I do think particularly people early in their journeys may not realize that, if you purchase a plugin or whether you get a free plugin, this is more common with free plugins. Yeah. Especially with free plugins, because there's really no incentive for the person unless they're monetizing it to keep going. This is actually, I'm so glad you mentioned this, Dan, because this is a 101 lesson with website security for web designers. Beware of free plugins because they will likely not be supported for that long. And if they are, they're hopefully going to have an upgrade or a premium account. That's why it's so worthwhile supporting people whose tools you use, because if you don't support them, they're not going to be in business, and then you're going to have a dodgy plugin, as you mentioned. So that's a great lesson because they can go out of date. And then, what happens in that case? Like if a plugin is unsupported, I've famously used the plugin Velvet Blues for URL changes if you need to replace old URLs with new URLs. I don't think that's been updated in quite a few years. What I've done, though, is I install it, use it, and then take it off right away. So it doesn't sit on my site unupdated. Is that a okay practice? Obviously, I guess the ideal practice would be not to use it at all. But if it is something that is so worthwhile and you're just used to that tool, is that an okay practice?
Well, I suppose there's two sides to that. There's one, which is what does it actually do? Because if it's something like that, it might only be a few lines of code. So it's probably quite hard to be vulnerable. I don't know. I haven't looked at it, but there are some plugins that barely actually do anything under the surface. So the chances of them introducing something nasty are quite low. But then the other side of it is if you deactivate a plugin, its changes in the database might still be there. If you delete it, at least any backdoors it sort of introduces, not on the database, but in WordPress itself, if you delete the plugin, not deactivate it, that removes some of those vulnerabilities.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's a big difference between deactivating something and then deleting, because deactivating means, it may not be active on the site, but it's still there, right? Like the plugin is still in in the case of WordPress, it's still in your content folder. Here's a detailed question. I don't want to take us too far in the weeds right away, but I'm curious about this. Let's say I'm backing up my website every week, and the previous update had a bad plugin. It was deactivated, but I didn't delete it. And then in the new update, I do delete that plugin, but that plugin, the old version, will still be in an old backup on my site that could be stored on my server. Is that still a vulnerability? When you basically, if you're backing up outdated plugins, even if you delete them in future, would that still be a vulnerability?
No, you should be okay, because it's not like that's running live on your web server. It shouldn't be accessible by anyone else.
Gotcha.
But one thing that is worth mentioning with backups is to not update onto the server that your site lives on. Reason being, I've just picked up a client who's lost a 300-page website because the backups are running on the same server as the website itself. So when a hosting issue came up with that, everything was gone, irrecoverable. Whereas if it was backed up to another server, for example, Amazon Web Services or Google Drive even, or it's stored on an old-fashioned pen drive, a USB stick.
Yep.
That wouldn't have happened.
What a valuable lesson. I've always said in the case of backups, 2 is 1 and 1 is none. So if you're storing all of your backups on your hosting server or whatever, and that goes down, case in point, that's what happens. What are you using for backups right now, Dan? I love Managed WP's external backups, but unfortunately they stopped doing that feature. But Updraft Plus is a great option. What are you using for backups, for external backups?
There's two sides to that as well. I like the idea of server level backups. So not using a plugin if you can avoid it. So I currently use a system called SpinUp WP for hosting, and that allows me to manage servers that I actually rent off DigitalOcean. So it's just like a third-party tool that helps me sort of maintain my servers.
Okay.
And that allows me to do automatic daily backups to another cloud provider. So in my case, they go to Amazon Web Services into S3 buckets. But then there's also in the IT world this thing called the 3-2-1 backup strategy. And within that, it's just it's a strategy. So you want to have 3 copies of every bit of data. Your live site is one of them. Your daily backup to another cloud is another. But then you also want a copy on another form of media, an external hard drive or something.
Yeah, so three levels. I like that. That's probably the best way to go, outside of even 2 different levels instead of just having server side and then an external side. I guess in a way I had 3 with my agency. I always had the managed WP backups, and then we would go the external backups at that time to Dropbox, but you could use Drive or whatever, and server. So it was like the three different levels.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. I love, man, the backup thing is crucial. I mean, I figured we would talk about backups at some point here because it's the backup in case your security is vulnerable. But getting back to some of the vulnerabilities on the websites, like probably everyone's top of mind thought is passwords. So
yeah,
I probably don't even need to ask this, but like, what have you seen with the problems with passwords from the client side and web design side?
Well, again, this goes back to people. You can have all the best systems in the world, but if someone's got password as their password, or I love GoDaddy, these are all common passwords that are on lists that get attempted daily on your site. Well, I recently installed a plugin that shows me who's trying to get in through the login form, and there's thousands of attempts every day with just random passwords.
So random passwords. So there are lists out there of common passwords that are getting targeted and archived somehow. Yeah.
So when a hosting setup gets breached, one of the main things they want to steal is the password list. Now, what should be in place is some proper password storage. So they should be stored in an encrypted form, so hashed and salted, for example, so that you can't reverse it. So the way hashing works is you take your password, for example, 123 GoDaddy, you pass it through this algorithm called a hash, and you add a bit of random stuff in it called a salt as well. That gets stored in gobbledygook in your database. There's no way of reversing it back to the password. So it's a one-way function, a bit like in maths when you had the little function box and you put one thing in it and something else comes out. It's a one-way function so that only the person who types in the right password can get a match, because then you'll get 2 gobbledygook sentences that match, and that shows that you got the password right.
Gotcha. That's interesting. What's your favorite password platform right now or tool?
So I don't like recommending these because I can't trust any of them fully. I personally use something called KeePass, which runs locally on my laptop, spelled K-E-E Pass. I don't quite like the idea of having them all sat in the cloud. Some of these big companies have had a bit of a ropey history.
Well, LastPass, unfortunately, which is who I use, just had a breach recently. Yeah. I just got a notification that they had some sort of breach, and I don't know if they only email people who are compromised. I haven't had an issue, knock on wood. Yeah. But yeah, it's like those can get breached as well. I can tell you that's not
their first as well.
Yeah. All right. Now I'm switching. All right. I knew I was going to be either getting into some new tools or switching some things around. So what about some of the other ones like 1Password or some of the others that are, what's the other biggie? There's LastPass, 1Password, and then, trying to remember.
There's quite a few of them. I mean, Apple do their own one. Google Chrome has its own one in the browser. I mean, passwords are just annoying, really, aren't they? Because you're best off having a separate one for each website.
Yeah.
I mean, how are you ever going to remember them all? You do need a tool like that.
Dashlane, that's what I was just thinking about. I just did a quick Google. Dashlane is the other one that I tried up. I didn't love the interface. But yeah, I mean, these are all, just like you said in the beginning, Dan, like you can't technically have a 100% secure website. And I don't think they claim to be that either. No one can technically, because you can there's always somebody who could find a way in. But that's the danger of some of these, aren't they?
And let's face it, someone who manages passwords is a great target for an attacker. A church website is probably less of an interesting target, but something with all those passwords.
That's a really good point. Okay, well, good. Now we're terrified. So, what's the best option for in your mind? What's the best option for password management? And then maybe we'll talk about some on-site stuff.
I suppose it is using a password manager. Try and find one that you can trust. I mean, for me, it's KeePass because it runs locally and it's open source.
Okay, so it's open source and local. Is that for Windows and Mac, or does it matter?
Yeah, you can get it. I think I use something called MacPass, which is like an abstraction of it.
Okay.
But something that's more important is using two-factor authentication where possible. So what that effectively means is you've got two different factors to authenticate you, which is obviously in the name. But what I'm trying to get at is it's not just having two passwords. So you have, for example, something you know, which is your password, and it's something you possess, which is your phone, which can give you a code. And that is a one-time code as well. So,
and that's really important. Like in this case, if you're using a local password manager, if your laptop gets stolen, they could potentially have access to all your passwords unless that is logged in with the two-factor authentication, right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think you can use it with KeePass currently, but there's a master password on that, and it's an encrypted file as well. So without the master password, and
gotcha,
you can't get in basically.
Okay, gotcha. Now, obviously, the actual passwords themselves for websites is key too. Like I love GoDaddy or 1234, some of these, common, probably super easy targeted passwords. Do you have a favorite password generating site?
No, I actually prefer stringing together lots of random words to make, say 4 or 5 words together as a password. Reason being, then I can, if you have to give a password to somebody through verbal communication, say on the phone, at least then you're not reading out 10 random letters, numbers, characters. There's plenty of entropy in that as well, because, it's 4 or 5 random words. It's not I love GoDaddy, by the way. It's,
Oh yeah.
I don't know.
What about the passwords that require a number and a exclamation point or something like that, or any sort of figure?
I mean, they're all just trying to make sure you're not using a bad password. But the problem is when it starts getting into random letters and numbers, it's very hard to remember, obviously, unless you're using a password manager.
Mm-hmm. Oh, totally. My gosh. I mean, at the height of the agency, I think I was managing, hundreds, maybe even well over 1,000 between like all the websites, all the tools, all their other stuff. I mean, that's why LastPass was key for me personally.
Yeah.
To be able to manage all that.
Yeah. And I suppose if you're using a password manager, it generates it for you anyway. Mm-hmm. So I'd probably just go with what that provides.
That's cool. What about, I've seen a bunch of different thoughts and I guess opinions on like the perfect amount of password letters or numbers. I've heard like 11 is a strong password. Is that true, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's down to entropy, which is how long it takes to brute force it effectively. So more, the better, really. That's why I got annoyed when I think it was Microsoft had a limit of 16. I wanted to go longer than 16. I couldn't because they just got some silly limit in place.
Gotcha. So longer the better. That's an easy lesson to remember.
Yeah.
Again, I don't know. I forget who said like 11 seems to be a trusted amount of figures for a password, but
yeah, I mean, some password managers set their own defaults, I think, but you can normally override it as well. And if you don't have to look at the password, you might as well make it as long as you can get away with.
Gotcha. So that's on our end as web designers, but bringing the client in here for projects,
interesting.
Right? Yeah, like we can empower them as much as possible, but what I'm gathering so far is kind of what I feel like you've been hinting at is that if you like, no matter what security system, for example, you have on your house, you could have the top notch stuff, but if you forget to turn it on and keep your door unlocked, then you are susceptible. It's kind of like that with clients, right?
Yeah. Especially if you give them admin when all they're going to do is upload a blog post.
Right.
Because it's very easy to give full access because it solves your headaches as a designer. There's no questions of, I can't do this, I can't do that.
There's a great lesson, especially for folks early on. Give your clients like editor access or moderator, whatever the term is, that doesn't give them complete full access. Now they could still, if they want to move on from you at any point in the future, you could have in your agreement that they will get access to their entire website if they, for whatever reason move on. But for right now, don't give them full access, because that can be absolutely detrimental, especially if they start changing passwords or adding new users, right? Like adding new users as admins with terrible passwords.
Well, if they insist on having an admin account, which some might do, they want full control, suggest having two accounts, one that they use day to day for logging in and adding blog posts, and then admin for when they really actually need it.
Oh, okay. That's cool. Yeah, I could see that being tricky for clients to remember, but I guess if you were to stress the security end of it, maybe that would help them realize, like, this is why, because admin accounts are much more acceptable to being hacked if you don't protect them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. So there's the passwords, there's the plugins, there's active versus deactive, and then obviously deleted ideally. What about the plugins that, like, it comes out that there is a vulnerability and there is an option to patch it, to do an upgrade? I mean, this is the importance of, you're in the Web Design Club. This is something that's brought up often. It's like, hey, we found a vulnerability in one of these plugins. Everyone using it, make sure you update. Where's the importance of that, and how much time, I guess probably sooner the better, but how much, I guess my question would be, like, how much time is there typically between somebody found a vulnerability and needing to update that before something could potentially happen?
Yeah, so that's called a 0-day vulnerability. What effectively means is you've got 0 days to fix the thing. So let's say an attacker finds a little issue in an image optimization plugin. Well, if they're a good hack, you can get ethical hackers, which are people who try and break it to report it and do the right thing. But let's say it's a bad guy. He's found a problem in it. Okay, he can start exploiting it on any website that has that plugin, and no one knows about the issue. It's not a known vulnerability at this point.
Not known.
Now, as soon as that development team find out about it, they've technically got 0 days to fix it, hence the name. They need to get a fix out as soon as possible. But obviously in WordPress, if you haven't got automatic updates enabled, which is another interesting topic, you've got to get in there and patch it yourself.
Or, well, what would be the plan B for that? Would it be to roll a backup before the vulnerability and then just update it? Or what would be the best cause of action there?
Well, it depends. If you know about a vulnerability and there's no updates, you're probably better off deleting the plugin itself. And you probably need to consider that with your clients and your care plans. What happens if this is a key plugin and it's vulnerable? How do we move forwards? Because you don't want to be spending 2 or 3 days rebuilding something.
Right.
With a different plugin, right?
Yeah, with a different plugin, exactly. Okay. So yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned it, Dan. Let's dive into automatic updates. Now, I personally have had a couple really bad experiences with automatic updates, particularly if things don't play nicely together, if there's a lot of different plugins at play. I mean, in an ideal world, it sounds amazing. It sounds great that, just everything updates automatically. And I found as long as you're using good tools that are known to work well together, and they're typically premium, that typically is an issue. But of course, there's going to be times where you need to do a little bit of testing, especially if you're running like a WooCommerce or e-commerce shop, and then there's a bunch of different tools at play. So yeah, what's your thoughts on automatic? And hit me with your thoughts.
So some of the premium plugins these days allow you to choose what updates you want. They're allowed to say none, all, or some of them have a third option, which is really useful, which is security ones only. Because some updates might be aesthetic things or extra features that they've implemented, which funnily enough could bring in extra vulnerabilities, because that's just development for you. So it's a tricky one, isn't it? Especially when you've got caching as well. Because if your cache doesn't get cleared when an update happens, stuff starts to just break.
Right.
It's a hard one to answer, really. Really, it's just getting things up to date as soon as possible, especially if there's a security issue.
Yeah, that's what I've talked about in my maintenance plan course, is that you want to have weekly, regular plugin updates, and then ideally daily checks, or at least scans. And then as many places you feel comfortable in being in, as far as forums or communities where people use the same tools you use, and then you're going to generally get to know pretty quickly. I mean, sometimes you'll hear about stuff in like a Facebook group before the company sends out an official email. So it's like, oh shoot, update this or roll that back right now, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that definitely makes a lot of sense. I feel like plugins, security, backups, what are the other security vulnerabilities in websites? Actually, here, before we get to that, Dan, I'm kind of curious. What about, so like my site has a lot of users on it, a ton of users, thousands of users on it. So I don't even know if I want to ask this question, but what's the vulnerabilities of like those people creating their accounts and passwords? Or because they are on a customer role on the site, is it that much of a vulnerability to me?
It's probably not a massive one to you. It depends on what plugins you've got and how they can interact with your website. So you were about to say what other sort of vulnerabilities can you get in a website? A big one is user input. And that's got multiple parts to it. But plugins should sanitize your data when it's uploaded. So let's say you've got a comments box on a blog post. I shouldn't be able to inject nasty code in there, in theory. But some plugins don't properly sanitize data. And that's how you get cross-site scripting and that sort of attack. So it depends on whether you accept user data. If you're using forms, for example, that allow me to upload files, perhaps you should limit what sort of files I can upload. Because Word, Excel, PowerPoint files, etc., I can do macro attacks where I can open calculators and all sorts on your computer.
That's interesting. I never even thought about that. Of course, my mind is racing with the forms that I have on my current site right now. Typically, it's mainly just pictures. Like I'm thinking about like my podcast guest form, which I think you've filled out by this point. It only accepts JPEGs, PNGs. I think that's it. So you can't even send over a PDF or a doc or an Excel file or anything. However, that's really common for, my gosh, depending on how people are collecting content. I guess that's a great heads up, and maybe a reason why you'd want to use like Content Snare or something that's built for that kind of thing. That way you're not potentially opening yourself up to, taking in a form that could have any sort of, would that be malware? Forgive my ignorance, but what would be malicious that people would send over? Like, what is that? I don't even know what that would be called.
So in some cases, you can actually do what's called a MIME sniffing attack. And this is quite a technical thing, but let's say I've got a PHP file, and PHP is what WordPress is built under. So you could put in some nasty code that makes your website do stuff it's not supposed to. That's called malicious code. Now, if I upload a file called, image.jpg, you'd assume it's an image, right? But I could have just changed a PHP file to an image name.
Gotcha.
Now, if I upload that and open it in an old version of Internet Explorer tries to be clever and goes, you've told me that's an image, but I can see it's actually PHP. So I'm going to give you the PHP side of it. And then bad stuff happens.
I see. Gosh, that's terrifying. This is terrifying. So I'm trying to keep this like stripped down to some recommendations to help folks as well, including myself. So limit file acceptance, right? Like limit what type of files you could take in.
Limit what files you're taking in. And with contact forms, at least the ones I've looked at, including premium ones, be really careful what data you collect on people. Just assume it could become public at some point. So don't go collecting sensitive things or confidential things on WordPress forms.
So what would be the next level back from that, particularly when it comes to like collecting content and sensitive data for clients? I mean, I don't think there's any reason why web designers would need like a social security number or anything like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Or even like an EIN or any sort of business number. But like, what would be the next level back? Just choosing a platform that is built for that? Like some sort of sensitive document.
I mean, heck, even paper-based in that form might be better than certainly than putting it on a WordPress website.
Yeah.
I just think it's a good approach to take if you just assume that anything that goes on there could become public at some point. Let's say your host is a bit dodgy. I'm not going to name any names here, but I'm sure you've got someone in mind. Let's say they managed to get in the database. That's all unencrypted stuff.
Gotcha.
So if you've got a coach therapist site and they've got massive forms full of sensitive data, that can all just be read in your database without a key or anything.
Yeah, because it's easy to forget that if somebody fills out a form that we have set up, like you might think about it for a few days, but that info stays on your site until it is potentially deleted as an entry or something. So if you do that over years, you could have a lot of sensitive data on there, which is very, very vulnerable. And there's probably a lot of liabilities with that too, if you were to get hacked and then a bunch of emails or just sensitive info gets out, right?
And the context matters as well. So some websites, for example, a web design club or your website, we're probably less fit less likely to fall victim to a social engineering attack. So say somebody got my contact number from your website for some reason and phoned me. Okay, that's not Josh calling me. Go away.
Oh, yeah.
But let's say it's a charity dealing with some vulnerable people, and then their phone numbers get leaked. They can say, hello, I'm here from charity X. I'm looking to help you with this, and they'll probably just fall victim to it.
Gotcha.
So the context of what the data's relevant to is sort of important there as well.
That's a good point. Well, I'll tell you this. We sold our house earlier this year, and I got so many calls. I don't know how those real estate networks work, but my God, I don't know if something was leaked or if that's just the way it is in real estate, that once a property goes out, they find your number and you get hit up like left and right.
I mean, that's what these sort of privacy laws like GDPR, et cetera, are trying to help with, but I don't think anyone's fully GDPR compliant, et cetera.
Well, I was just thinking, it reminds me a lot of both privacy, like security reminds me a lot of privacy and accessibility. Those are two topics. I don't have, like, unfortunately, I need to dive into this, especially for my audience as a whole. I want to try to empower everyone with all the options and make sense of all this stuff. It reminds me so much of those two things because Hans and Donata and everyone at Termageddon have told me the same thing. You're never going to be like 100% privacy compliant. Like there's always there's updates and things are changing, which is why I love that tool because it's automated as a privacy policy. But the same thing with accessibility. Those in the accessibility world I've talked to said the same thing. You're never going to have a 100% accessible website. Same thing with security. Like you do the best you can to get to as much. I mean, I guess that's the way we need to frame it to clients too, right? Like we do our best. We keep up on things and we're going to, I don't know if anyone is saying there's 100% guarantee, but yes, definitely.
No, I would never say that. And I'd also say there's always room to make a bit of money in security as well. If you find out about a new control and you sort of risk assess the client site and think that would be really useful to them, there's no harm in mentioning it to them.
Good point. And look, quite honestly, that's when I started my maintenance plan and my security. I called it my maintenance and security plan because I had sites getting hacked and my site got hacked while I was on my honeymoon. Like I had terrible experiences with security, probably because I'm not super security minded and I didn't have all the measures in place in the first place, but still that really became a big thing for me. And then, I mean, I don't want to say I capitalized on it, but I certainly was like, I want to offer security. And this is a value add. This is a product that I'm going to do. And it was one of the major things that led me to start my maintenance and security plan. So you're 100% right, Dan. Like a lot of this stuff probably seems overwhelming, but you can make a service out of it or add it to your packages and charge for it. And clients here, I'm kind of curious, how do you sell security? Because I talk about this in my maintenance plan course, but I want to hear it from your perspective. Like, clients who are specifically not security minded, they're not going to understand any of this. So how do we frame it to them and help sell them from the ground up or even ongoing?
I normally use the analogy of an onion. So an onion's got loads of layers, and that's how you want to approach security. So the main thing you're trying to protect in that center is the data. And you're just going to have loads of layers of controls. That could be some extra plugins that help enhance your security. Could be hardening your hosting setup a bit more. Using a better host is a good one for that as well. That's very important.
Do CDNs like Cloudflare or any of these, do those help with security at all, or is that unrelated?
Yeah, so security, one part of that is the availability of your site. So especially in the case of an e-commerce site or a political site or something like that, denial of service attacks are where people try and pull down your site by hitting the server too many times. That can also happen with the DNS as well, which is what serves your website through the domain. So services like Cloudflare and general CDNs help with availability. So it helps you become a bit more resilient to denial of service attacks.
Yeah, that makes sense. And are there any other vulnerabilities that maybe are like on-site related that we haven't glanced over to this point, Dan? I mean, we talked passwords, we talked plugins, obviously themes and the actual, builders and the tools. The same thing. Like that's why I update Divi as long as I feel comfortable, particularly if it's a smaller update. If it's a bigger update, I'll wait to see if there's any bugs that need patched and then update that. I don't know. Any thoughts on that, or is there anything else on the on-site side of things?
Yeah, one that will be very easy to glance over is your licenses. So let's say you're taking out a premium license for a plugin, but you decide either you don't want it anymore or you just forgot to renew it. Well, say you've missed a few emails, you've got a busy inbox. Well, you'll no longer get an updates for that premium plugin if they don't allow you to update when you haven't got a valid license.
Ah, I see. Oh, that's a great heads up on that. Yeah. Cause you could potentially, depending on their automations, if you have like 30 days to renew and you don't renew and then it goes away, you're on your own completely unless you manually or intentionally look up updates or, remember your renewal.
But you might not be able to update it. You might be stuck at the version that you got to until your payment expired and they won't give you those future versions.
That's good. What a great point. So themes, anything else on site?
I'd probably say it's a constantly changing landscape, really. So, what we could say in this conversation today, it could change in a month, a year, 2, 3 years. I mean, you didn't used to get automatic updates for WordPress unless you used a third-party plugin. So that's something that had changed. And, it's an improvement for the small sites. Obviously, it's a pain point for e-commerce and the bigger sites that are more complex.
Yeah. Speaking of WordPress theme, plugin management, what tools are you comfortable with? I like Manage WP. I've used that since 2016. But do you have any tools for the updates, backups, anything like that, other than what you've already talked about?
So I like having something that looks for vulnerabilities in my plugins. But I also I use this thing called Spin Up WP to manage my server. And that allows me to do backups and updates through that.
Okay, you can do updates through that too.
Yeah, I do my updates through that. It will take a backup when I do it, and then it will clear the CDN after. Sorry, the cache.
Very cool.
My issue with Managed WP is it has admin access to every website.
Right.
So if your account gets breached or something goes wrong with Managed WP, they've got admin to all your websites that are managed through it. So I'm a bit wary of it.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I that makes sense. That thought crossed my mind back then for sure. That's one reason we do have, with the agency, like we have multiple two-factor, and actually Eric just recently requested that on my end for those sites that I turn that on for myself as well, just to make sure everyone has two-factor identification before logging in. Because that Managed WP, I love that from the web design aspect because I don't need to remember passwords. I can just go in there, go to the site, and we're off. But there's I guess one lesson I'm kind of pulling from this is that if things are super easy from a user perspective, it's probably more vulnerable. So
two-factor authentication is a great example. It makes life a lot more tricky to log in, but it does make it a lot more secure.
Yeah. Do you think we're ever going to find a happy medium to where things are super secure and not such a pain in the ass?
Passwords are hopefully going to be a thing of the past in the future.
What would Touch ID and stuff?
Or also just passwordless logins, one-time passwords. So you might have noticed things like Airbnb have an option to just log in through a code. So you type in your email and it will send you a code. Because the thing is, if you've got a password to a website, you can always just click reset password and you'll get a sign-in link to set a new password. So why don't we just remove a password and send a sign-in link with a one-time code or something?
I know that is nice. Like we're recording this on Riverside right now. I just started using, and I can just log in as long as I'm logged in through my Gmail, which is through my Google Workspace. That's how I get in. That's how I get into this. I don't even need to go through email and a password.
Yeah.
That's a good
it's just
example.
Nice things to, you still got security there, but it's just a bit easier to work with.
Yeah. And I love your analogy of the onion, how it's like, I feel like we were glancing over the top few layers. I don't know how deep we want to go into this because I'll probably get confused, but what are the deep levels of security past everything we've talked about, particularly from websites?
So something that I've looked at, the sort of key security plugins and guides and stuff online, nothing seems to mention security HTTP headers, and I don't know why. So these are something...
We don't have to name the company, but is that what you showed me recently in the Web Design Club? How you were able to just for everyone's reference, Dan, you're a good hacker. You're a good guy. But Dan basically showed me how he could break into a couple of these really well-known tools with this header kind of thing.
Yeah. So these days, browsers are trying to help you out. They're trying to help secure your experience on the web. But they're only going to do that in some cases if you tell them what to do. So there is these things called security headers, which allow you to tell the browser, don't allow cross-site scripting if you can detect it. Only serve a page in HTTPS using SSL. Don't allow HTTP anymore. Don't allow clickjacking, which is what me and Josh were just talking about. And also have a content security policy. This is all very, technical stuff with controls, but a content security policy can basically say, allow Google fonts, allow images from Josh's website, don't allow anything else. So if a dodgy plugin gets in there and starts trying to redirect you to something even more dodgy, your browser should step in and help because it's been told to.
And how do you implement these measures? Is this like custom code? Is this a tool that does this?
So I think the best way of doing it is on the hosting itself. So they're sent by your server to say, they're called HTTP response headers. So when you make a request, say to joshhall.co, your server responds with the page and says, these are some extra headers, please respect them. And hopefully your browser will, respect them.
How do you actually do that through hosting? Is that something like, I have no idea on that end. Is that something that you have to like talk to your hosting about, or would it just be in like the header, like code you put in your header kind of situation?
It's probably best to talk to your host about that sort of thing. It's very hard to say without knowing who you're with.
Yeah.
Some run on Apache, some are Nginx. And the way you do it's slightly different. So in my case, I put it in the Nginx files, which is a bit messy and hard to do, but it adds a good layer of security.
And that would alleviate the issue of like an update, right? Like if you update WordPress, of it overriding that code.
Yes, exactly. And also, I could have all the greatest plugins in the world, but if I get on the hosting and just delete the folder, the plugins are gone. And so I can just suddenly do all this bad stuff on your site. Whereas if it's done at the server level, at least there's an extra layer there.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Also, your users can't break it then as well.
Is there a resource for that, Dan, that we could link? I'm keeping track of all the links that we've talked about, the response headers and all that stuff. Is there a resource on that would be good to add into the show notes that people could check out if they decide to really take the deep measures? Yeah. And by the way,
I'd say it is a deep measure.
This is something that you could do as a extreme value add in security for anyone who's like, I'm never going to do that. Like you could charge for it. If you're running like a really important e-commerce site that's doing, like a lot of money, then maybe it's really important to do something like this.
Yeah, it's probably not a quick control to implement. Probably going to take a few hours. Well worth doing on staging and testing on lots of browsers, because it could stop parts of your site working properly if you don't do it right. But there's two tools. So there's one to scan for security headers, and that's written by a guy called Scott Helm. The tool is called securityheaders.com. So you can scan your site. You might want to click hide results so you don't show up in the Hall of Fame or the Hall of Shame.
Okay.
But yeah, Scott Helm's got some great resources on security headers in general, so it's worth looking at his blog. He doesn't show how to add them to WordPress, though. I think you need to work with your host on that, because it is going to be quite specific to their hosting environment.
Gotcha. So Scott Helms. Okay, cool. So we'll have that linked. I know we're covering a lot of different links, but I'm keeping track of all this. So my awesome VA Cam can link these in the show notes for everybody for this episode. But yeah, what about like, I don't want to take too far of a tangent, Dan, in the deep stuff, but what are like the headers is a big one. I guess, is there anything like that we haven't talked about that is a huge deal as far as security?
Yeah. So this is more of a high level strategy thing that I think gets missed in the website world. So if I was to start a baking business and make some nice cakes, I'd have to do a risk assessment, and I'd have to consider what could go wrong and what I'm going to do to try and avoid it going wrong. Allergens, food poisoning, all that nasty stuff. And also get inspected. Someone would come to check my kitchen out and check, it's a clean place. There's not rats running around everywhere, etc. Well, in the web world, we don't really get told to do that. So I'd say before considering all these controls, security headers, two-factor, all that sort of stuff, just do a risk assessment. Consider what you're trying to protect. So people's data is the main one, but also things like your reputation, that's an asset. Your money's an asset. So consider your assets, do a risk assessment where you consider, what possible vulnerabilities have we got? What threats have we got? And the way to imagine that, the game Jenga, where you've got all those bricks. Say you're halfway through the game and someone's removed one of the bottom bricks. That's your vulnerability, is the thing can now topple over. That's your weakness in the tower. Your threat could be, let's have a think. Threat-wise, you could have a natural one. Let's say you could have an earthquake. That's sort of out your hands. But you could have an intentional one. Let's say I'm playing against Josh and Josh kicks the table leg. That causes it to sway on my go and I lose. There could also be unintentional. For example, I make a mistake, I pull one out and the whole tower falls over. So there's different types of threats. There's also likelihood, is it actually going to happen to me? So you have to think, in terms of risk, is this actually a risk that could happen? And what would the impact be on me if it does happen?
Gotcha. Do you have this as a resource, Dan? This Dan's risk assessment recommendation?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
So that's a new service I'll be launching in the coming months. It's called riskbuddy.com. And it's just going to help people establish that basic risk assessment to know how to move forwards, really.
Awesome. Is there anything live right now, or is that just all in the works?
It's very much in the works, but it's just going to help people raise awareness, really, of just basic security stuff that they can add in.
I love the name, riskbuddy.com. That's great.
It's spelled with an I. So it's
Buddy. Not Buddy Y. Got it.
Yeah.
Super cool. Well, as soon as we have that available, we'll add to the show notes. I know we're recording this before you do the training in the Web Design Club, but you are doing a training for the club here. Yeah, I think this will go live shortly after that, which the replay will be available for anyone who joins after this chat. But I'm really excited to see you kind of take a deeper dive into security and help web designers and clients. I mean, like I said, I think most people are probably along the lines of how I feel about this stuff, where we get into web design to help clients grow and learn design. We don't necessarily get into it to be a developer and to be a security person. So
exactly.
We need help. Like, this is why I'm so glad to have folks like you and my corner, Dan, to kind of help educate me on some of the stuff that, some of it's pretty 101 and elementary that are just good to have reminders of, but some of it is like, I didn't know a thing about the whole header access stuff. Like that is beyond what I even was aware of. So
that's why I think awareness is a big thing. So even if you haven't got a control in place for it, at least you know that there's a possible solution there.
When I like the idea of like the tiered, kind of like the Onion, like the tiered security that you could potentially sell and offer, which you could roll into maintenance plans for sure.
Yeah.
Like you could have the level 1, which is just strong passwords, 2-factor, basic stuff. Level 2, maybe like more intentional, frequent backups, different security measures for websites. And then the top tier could be the header stuff, or like really advanced, maybe more CDN kind of stuff. Like, you could really, really take this to a whole nother level. Do you have any plans of doing any consulting on this, or doing actual like work on this? Or I'm just kind of curious for where you see your security help stuff going, Dan. Do you feel like you'll just do more courses, or what do you have in mind moving forward? This might be a great time to talk about what the vision for you with this stuff.
Yes, it's still early days. I'm sort of seeing it as a software platform where you can just pay each month, have your risk assessment, and then learn a bit about the controls and how they can help you and your clients. And obviously you can make money by charging. You can pass on the cost to your client.
Yeah.
I just think awareness is such a big thing. And also having a strategy in place to know what to do next. So at least then every month you can make a little change to your websites that over time it can compound and really help with your security.
I love that idea. I think like a community aspect back behind that could be great too, because security is definitely something that is not fun to go alone in, especially if you're not terribly versed in it. So I love where you're headed with that stuff, man. I think that's...
in some ways, I think imposter syndrome's born in the security world. It's full of people in black suits who, oh my God, you don't know that. Well, no. So I think it's just good to take complex things and just make them simple and sort of help show how it can make a site more secure. In terms of vulnerabilities and threats, if I told you about clickjacking, it would just pass over your head because you can't visualize it.
Right.
Whereas when I showed you that demo of me doing it to a website, suddenly you can see how it can happen and how that could be exploited in the wild.
No, that makes total sense. And I'm definitely going to recommend that we send people to riskbuddy with an i.com because it looks like you got a basic mailing list that you could sign up for so we could keep up to date on what's going on there. Before I have a final question for you, Dan, I'm kind of curious. I meant to ask this earlier. What is the big benefit for hackers? Like, are a lot of people hacking into websites? I've heard this talked about for years, especially when I had sites getting hacked and stuff. Are they logging? Are they breaking into them just to kind of like build a portfolio of their hackability skills, or is there actually financial gain in the form of like the list and the data and stuff?
Depends very much on the reason for it. You could even have company A attack company B, because then company B gets a bad reputation and company A looks amazing.
Gotcha.
I mean, that's in the corporate world more, I think. You get targeted attacks. Let's say you've got an e-commerce store, there's loads of order data there. That's quite useful. We'll have some of that. Then you get people just doing it because they can. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it varies really.
Yeah, I had heard somebody say that like a lot of people are potentially like up and coming hackers who just do it to show like, hey, I hacked into this site, site, and they kind of build a portfolio for it. Cause I'm sure obviously it's a whole industry in itself. So I have no interest.
When you get organizations just out there trying to hack people, when you combine several people, it becomes quite powerful.
Yeah. What about, real quick before we wrap this up, Squarespace, Wix, some of these like self-hosted platforms. Where's the security vulnerabilities? I meant to ask this earlier, but I want to make sure we don't glance over that because I'm sure a lot of people who don't use WordPress are probably like, well, what about me? Where this audience now is very diverse, even outside of WordPress. So yeah, what about the self-hosted platforms?
That's why I tried to avoid talking just about WordPress vulnerabilities and things. I mean, passwords, that affects everybody. Domains, that affects everybody. With WordPress, the nice thing about it is we can see what's going on underneath the bonnet, so we can see where the issues lie. With things like Wix, Squarespace, Shopify, you don't see so much of that because it's all behind closed doors. So don't just assume something's secure because you can't see what's going on. And, WordPress gets a very bad reputation for security, but it is possible to harden it up fairly well.
Well, I mean, I think with anything open source that is... I feel like a tool that's open source that gives the user so much power, inevitably you're going to open yourself up to, more vulnerabilities because you're giving people the option to do that. Plus, I mean, what's WordPress, like 30, almost 40% of the internet right now? Yeah. Something like that. So it's, of course it's going to get much more heat than some of these other platforms. But yeah, what about the self-hosted? Like where's the vulnerabilities in those? Because they often patch their own plugins and stuff. Is there vulnerability in like, the Squarespace server, like the server side of things and the like what's controlling everything else?
Yeah. You've got the basic things like login, which you're never going to get past really. And two-factor authentication helps with that. But there's always a risk of, us developers we don't like to, but we make mistakes. And that's where most vulnerability seems to come from. It's basic mistakes. Things get missed. A change gets made on a Friday afternoon just before everyone goes to the pub. These are the sort of things that happen in every company, really. And so that's how the vulnerabilities creep in. How long it takes them to realize and patch, well, that's going to vary.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It kind of reminds me of Managed WP too, to where like the scary thing about a Squarespace or something like that is like if the main channel gets breached, then that could all of your websites and work could be potentially at risk without you even knowing or doing a thing about it. So I guess it's a lot like hosting. I guess that could apply to a lot of different things, but that definitely.
Like I mentioned with contact forms, I can see that most of them in WordPress don't encrypt the data. So it's just stored there for everyone to read. But you don't know what's going on in Squarespace. Here's a vulnerability. How about I phone up Squarespace and let's say you've got a website there. I'll phone them up and pretend to be you. Now, if I can social engineer them, I can say, I've only got an hour. I need to be really quick and make this change. I might get done for copyright or something like that. They might let me in.
Gotcha.
Or they might give me a bit of data that's useful for me to then get in later. So, there's still, it all boils down to people still, really.
Yeah.
If people have bad passwords, if there's bad security training in there, they're not aware of phishing attacks. social engineering. Yeah.
Well, thank God there's good hackers like you, Dan, who know a lot about this and are doing good things in the world to help people. My gosh. Yeah, this has been great, man. This has been really fascinating for me. I appreciate you being really open to asking or answering a lot of questions that I have about security. And I hope this has helped others. We've talked about a load of resources that I've got ready to be bookmarked or to be linked up in the show notes for this episode. Where would you like people to go, Dan, to find out more about you? Do you want them to go to Risk Buddy? Is that the best resource?
Yeah, head over to Risk Buddy. You'll find out a bit more about me, my story, and how we can work together to help you just get more awareness about security.
Awesome. And that's Risk Buddy with an I, riskbuddi.com.
That's the one.
You got a free sign up there to stay in the know of what you have coming down the road. I would have loved to have had this conversation when you had everything ready to go, but I couldn't help it. I wanted to talk about security, particularly around the time you'll be presenting in my web design club with a training on this, which again will be as a replay for anyone who joins after Dan presents in the club. So when you join, you'll get access to that training as well. But yeah, Dan, thanks for your time, man. This has been eye-opening, terrifying, but also fun and empowering too. So I feel much better about, especially this like idea of like even just awareness, risk assessment.
Yeah.
Like, okay, here's what I have. Where are the risks? What can we do to chip away at protecting ourselves as much as possible? I love that.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Dan. Hey friends, it's Josh here. I just wanted to mention a couple quick things before you head out. First off, if you've been enjoying the show, please consider leaving a podcast review. I personally read all the podcast reviews. I love hearing your thoughts and feedback on the show, and it also really helps grow this podcast. You can do that easily if you go to joshhall.co/podcast review, and you can leave a review wherever you listen to the show. And then I also wanted to make sure you know that for all the extras on every one of these podcast episodes, you can go to joshhall.co/podcast. We have a post there for every episode, which includes full transcriptions, timestamps, and all the links and resources that we mentioned. So just go to joshhall.co/podcast for all the extra goodies. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you on the next episode.